all that we've seen this week, this incredible crescendo of alarm. There's no other way really to say it.
If they were to lift sanctions that have been in place for quite some time now, that's ultimately kind of a victory for them.
Because Iran is not in a hurry here. It's discovered that it has this amazing tool in its toolkit, which is the Strait of Hormuz. Hi, guys. Good to see you again. Big development this week. We've been talking so much about the war in Iran, but this week a ceasefire deal was agreed between Iran and the US, brokered by Pakistan. So we're in a sort of interesting holding pattern now to see whether that lasts, whether a more permanent deal can be done. Great relief, of course, to the Iranian people, but straining of relations with many of the allies, it would seem.
Well, I think this conflict will have long-lasting impact even after it ends, whether it ends in the next 2 weeks or it drags on any further. I think a lot of these relationships won't go back to being the same as they were before the conflict broke out. I think NATO perhaps is the most obvious example of that, where he was already upset at NATO because of disagreements over Greenland, and this conflict, no matter what the eventual outcome of the ceasefire is, I mean, that relationship is one that's very, very strained.
And just look at the relationships across the Gulf as well. For the Gulf, they will now see an Iran that has been wounded and is weaker, but perhaps might rebuild with a vengeance, if that's possible. We don't know how long that will take. We also, of course, see the relationship of the US with Israel, which President Trump has described as being hand in glove. But did President Trump actually consult the Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, before announcing a ceasefire? It seems that they see these as separate fronts of a war that can also be operated separately. There was that long, in-depth New York Times article describing how it was the Israeli prime minister and the head of Mossad that had come to the White House and had convinced, more or less, the president of why they needed to go to war with Iran. And I wonder if President Trump steps back from this war, whether he also questions some parts of that relationship going forward.
I think there are many questions about the US Israel relationship now, and they started, at least amongst the people in this country, long before this Iran war. I mean, I think there have been great question marks raised since maybe a year after the October 7th, 2023 attacks started, and you started to see some cracks in the support here in the US. Um, but on the New York Times article that you mentioned, Sumi, I mean, there's a lot of chatter amongst people like us who are very interested in what goes on in the White House and so on. But if we remember back just a couple of days into the war, Secretary of State Marco Rubio actually said words to that effect. I mean, he was up on Capitol Hill there to brief some of the senators, and he was asked, exactly sort of questions along how did the president come to make this decision, and he basically said, well, Israel came to us, and Israel was going to go and launch an attack on Iran anyway, and so we were drawn into it that way. So I don't know that there's a lot of daylight really between that New York Times article and what really happened, based on what Marco Rubio was saying in those early days.
It also builds upon the resignation of Joe Kent, the director of the National Counterterrorism Center, who said very explicitly that in his view, Israel dragged the US into the war. And I think, that's kind of the difference now compared to when the war with Hamas broke out, and that there's people generally within Trump's camp. I mean, Joe Kent, for example, is he's not a Democrat, he's not a liberal, he's very much an America first Republican. But even, there's Republican influencers, Benny Johnson, for example, who has a huge following among MAGA people. They're now publicly questioning Israel's role in getting the US into this conflict. And I think if in the long term Israeli operations in Lebanon kind of derail any sort of negotiated process over the next few weeks, then people, including many Republicans, will kind of blame Israel for keeping this going past when the administration thinks they accomplished all their military objectives.
There was some really interesting research out from Pew Research this week, and Pew Research is a very reputable research organization, very much nonpartisan, very scientific in how it collects its data. And it said that 6 in 10 Americans now have an unfavorable view of Israel, up 7 percentage points in the last year, but up a massive 20 points since 2022. So it just shows you what has happened to American people's view of Israel since, the Hamas attacks and everything that's come after that. And to be have 6 in 10 Americans having an unfavorable view of Israel, such a long time ally that presidents of all persuasions have backed Israel, have spoken so fondly of them, have looked to the Israeli communities, to the Jewish communities for funding ahead of elections. Both parties very supportive. And to see figures like that is really something that I don't think anyone could have predicted. And, there's a big jump in Democrats who now view Israel unfavorably, but there's also a significant jump in Republicans as well. And even more interestingly, and to your point, Bernd, about the, sort of influencers and podcasters and so on, there's a big jump in Republicans aged under 50 who now have an unfavourable view of Israel, an unfavourable view of Prime Minister Netanyahu as well, whereas older Republicans still kind of are very supportive of Israel and are very supportive of the president supporting Israel. So that's, I think, a really interesting one to see where that relationship goes into the future as well. And, Israel is continuing its war in Lebanon, notwithstanding the ceasefire deal that was agreed between the US and Iran for hostilities there. So this is far from over, to state the obvious.
I think it's really interesting also to see beyond the views on Israel among the Republican Party, all that we've seen this week, this incredible crescendo of alarm. There's no other way really to say it after the president's messaging, both on Easter Sunday and then his threat to wipe out an entire civilization. You started to see not just the Republicans who have been skeptical of this war, and we've talked about that right wing influencer circle where we've seen some of those points voiced, but real concern among some of the more traditional MAGA Republicans as well over the language that President Trump used. I mean, obviously, you have the Democrats talking about the 25th Amendment, questioning whether the president is fit to serve office. But to see some Republicans really see that perhaps this war was about to spiral out of control before the ceasefire was announced really made me think about the detritus of this war when it comes to the political consequences for President Trump. And it brings me again back to that New York Times article where J.D. Vance, which, if we're Kremlinologists, we could say that perhaps it was the president himself who leaked some of these internal meetings and messages that happened. We don't know to the New York Times. But that was one of the points that he brought up as to why he was opposed to this war, is he thought that it would have serious political consequences for President Trump.
I think one interesting thing about the civilization threat from President Trump was in a lot of people's minds from both sides of the political spectrum, it really highlighted that the plight of Iran's people has become not even a secondary objective in this war. It's almost not discussed at all. It's not discussed as one of the main military objectives. President Trump earlier this year told the Iranian people he would come to their aid when they were protesting, and many of them were being killed. None of that has really kind of translated into any sort of action during this war. And there again, I think once this is all said and done, people will be looking to see what the Israelis said about how the Iranian people would react to this. That New York Times story suggested that the Israelis kind of helped convince Trump that this would start some sort of uprising or kind of domestic movement inside Iran that would perhaps topple the government. That ultimately didn't happen. And I think even Iranian Americans who supported the conflict saw that civilization comment and wonder, we're not really talking about helping the Iranian people anymore. We're now talking about bombing their bridges and their power infrastructure, which would ultimately harm the people more than the government.
In that New York Times article, it quotes some people in the room as saying to President Trump about the points Israel was making about it creating an uprising in Iran, that was, I'll use a polite word, nonsense, but that was not the word that was used in the room, that just wasn't a realistic sort of end goal of this. And they thought the Israelis were overselling what was on the table. And again, I go back to Marco Rubio in the capital just a couple of days later when he was asked about regime change in the Iranian people. And he said, no, this isn't about regime change. Sure, that would be nice if it comes along afterwards, but that's not what our primary military objectives are here. So, it's perhaps not surprising that we have heard very little about that throughout these past few weeks. And President Trump, when he's asked about this, sort of says, well, there has been regime change because they did kill the Ayatollah Khamenei in the first 24 hours. And so that person has been replaced, even if the regime itself hasn't. It's like he equates regime change with personality change, even though the same sort of mindset and the same thoughts and regime are still there. So I think, we're talking to some of our colleagues in our BBC Persian service. Listening to them about how the Iranian people felt on Tuesday is quite spine chilling, that people were sort of spending the day thinking, are we going to be bombed off the face of the earth tonight? Staying up late to see what would happen when that deadline passed, stockpiling candles and food in case, the civilization wasn't bombed, but all of the power plants were, and they would lose power and they would lose the ability to, go about their daily lives. I mean, there was really a sense of panic and a sense of terror created for 93 million people or thereabouts.
I think some people close to the White House would make the argument that that sort of rhetoric is what ultimately got Iran to theoretically agree to a
Yeah.
ceasefire. But I think, on the ground in Iran and even in foreign capitals, I mean, I was speaking to some diplomats here in Washington after that threat. I mean, they didn't know what to make of it either. So, it just shows on one hand, I mean, this is kind of Trump's classic way of negotiating, kind of making maximalist threats in a bid to kind of prompt some sort of action or bringing someone to the negotiating table. But I think in this case, just given the seriousness of what he said and the language he used to say it, it really kind of caused a lot more alarm than previous instances of him doing something similar in the past.
I wonder if he did in that statement, though, cross a line that really was reflected by some of the reaction that we saw across Washington. I'm thinking of Senator Ron Johnson speaking to Fox News saying, we're essentially supposed to be the good guys. We're not at war with the Iranian people. We're at war with the Iranian regime. And this is not how we speak about going to war with the regime. I wondered in a way if that type of reaction would be reflected more broadly across the party and if that reached President Trump.
Well, I think, I mean, I got the sense that the White House was kind of unprepared for the reaction. I mean, for that civilization comment kind of hijacked Caroline Levitt's briefing. That became kind of almost as much of a story at that briefing as did the ceasefire in general. I thought it was quite notable. One young Iranian reporter who was there kind of chimed in and said that a family member of hers had called to say goodbye because of Trump's comments, and I think that's not exactly the reaction the president was hoping for. And I think kind of put them on the back foot at having to explain how they went from promising to help the Iranian people while they were protesting to now having to explain what exactly the president meant when he said he would end the civilization. The White House, I think, was also caught a little off guard because, when many people heard that comment, they automatically thought about the prospect of nuclear weapons in some form. I mean, there was nothing to indicate that that was the case, but just the language used led people to believe that that was on the table, and they were kind of bombarded with questions about that, to the email box at the press office very, very quickly.
I think that was largely because of what JD Vance said in Hungary, though, when he was asked about it. And he said, the US military has lots of tools in its toolkit that we haven't used yet, and which some people leapt to sort of interpret as nuclear weaponry. And obviously, the White House was very quick to push back and say, no, there are many other tools before we start talking about nuclear weapons that we could use. But I do think that kind of clamour that we started to hear from Republicans may have been feeding in, if not to President Trump, to some of the people around him. like just a couple of hours before the ceasefire was announced, I had the Republican congressman from Georgia, Austin Scott, on the show, very loyal supporter of Donald Trump. And I asked him about those comments, and he said he fundamentally disagreed with what President Trump was saying. He said his comments were counterproductive. He called on the president to take back those words. So when you start hearing people that normally never criticize the president saying so on a live interview, I feel like a Rubicon slightly has been crossed. Now, does it remain crossed, or when we're in a ceasefire pattern, do those people go back to being loyal supporters? Because then the deal came out, and you've someone like Senator Lindsey Graham, another very loyal supporter of President Trump, very hawkish on Iran, we should point out, but he's questioning now the deal that President Trump has sort of not signed up to, but agreed to sort of move forward for these 2 weeks with, saying some things in it are very troubling. And in a way, they are. I mean, there are points in these plans, if we're to believe what's been put out there, and there are countering versions of what's in the plan, they contain things that no American president could ever agree to sign up to with Iran. So, and things that Gulf partners are not going to be in favor of either. When you look at this concept of perhaps a toll on the Strait of Hormuz that Iran and the US would both manage and then share the proceeds of, well, that's not at all going to be welcomed by Gulf allies.
No, not at all. And just a follow up point to Senator Lindsey Graham's comments, I found it really interesting that one of his tweets or posts on X that he said, "I look forward to the vice president coming to Congress to explain this agreement and how it serves the American people." We know, as we mentioned already, that it was J.D. Vance who was opposed vocally to this war, but also that he was one of the main figures who was fielding phone calls, making phone calls to try to get Pakistan to help broker a ceasefire. And Lindsey Graham might be pointing the finger at JD Vance there to say, if we end up with a bad deal, we know who might have been the architect of that. Whether that's fair or not, it's hard to say. But it's also clear that President Trump's demands of Iran simply are going to be non-starters for them as well. He has said in one of his Truth Social posts, no enriching uranium. Iran has never agreed to that and very likely will not agree to that. So where do you go from here? And I think this is the point I keep hearing from military experts, from diplomats I've been speaking to, which is there was a deal in place, and we know that President Trump has completely bashed the deal that was brokered under President Obama. He tore it up when he got into office and continues to bash it. But if the deal that is reached allows some uranium enrichment and some payment to Iran via tolls that is greater than what was agreed under President Obama, you're going to see that criticism over and over from Democrats and possibly from some of President Trump supporters.
Or if sanctions are lifted on Iran, which some
Right.
reports suggest is something they want, I mean, that automatically, I think, in the lot of minds of a lot of people, means that Iran is coming out of this conflict in a strengthened position. I mean, even despite the military losses and all the infrastructure damage they've suffered, if they were to lift sanctions that have been in place for quite some time now, that's ultimately kind of a victory for them. I think for the White House, kind of the more difficult part is if the conflict were to resume after they've declared victory in kind of the main points, destroying Iran's navy, the ballistic missile and drone programs, the highly enriched uranium facilities that are still buried. I think that's very difficult to explain to the American people then, why this thing is still happening if those things were accomplished. I mean, and then if the administration uses the Strait of Hormuz as a partial justification for resuming hostilities, that only became a problem when the operation started in the first place. So, I mean, it's a very complicated thing to communicate to the American people, if this doesn't work out in the long run.
Yeah, I expect if the ceasefire holds that the talks timetable may just keep getting pushed back and pushed back and
Yeah.
pushed back. I mean, that's what's happened previously with the Iranian rounds of talks. It takes a long time. Speaking to people who are expert in this, who've been involved in various Iranian US negotiations over the years, they're saying 2 weeks, no way. 2 weeks is not enough time, particularly because Iran is not in a hurry here. It's discovered that it has this amazing tool in its toolkit, which is the Strait of Hormuz, that it can fire up drones again and basically shut that down at any point that it wants to. It's not in any hurry. It's in this for the long haul. It's been planning for it for decades and definitely been planning for it since last June with Operation Midnight Hammer. Whereas the US is in a hurry. President Trump is in a hurry to get a deal done. He doesn't want this dragging on. He doesn't want fuel prices remaining as high as they are or going even higher. He doesn't want, to have to go to Congress looking for more money and face a huge debate over funding. Because again, speaking to particularly Republicans, I mean, Democrats have said, they're going to vote no to this, but particularly Republicans saying the discussion and the debate over extra funding for this war effort with Iran is going to be really tight, really long, and potentially quite nasty, because that's going to be the thing that's really hard for members of Congress facing election to go back to their electorate and say, oh yeah, it's already cost so much money and now we've agreed for a few $100 billion more, and expect that will wash with people who are struggling to put petrol or gas in their car and any other knock-on impacts, financial knock-on impacts that we're going to see.
And to that point, I think there was also a lot of kind of public anxiety already about the defense budget more broadly. Recently they announced the new defense budget of $1.5 trillion, which is a high and kind of a massive increase at the expense of domestic policies that were reduced by 10%. So I think, that combined with that doesn't include any funding directly tied to this conflict either, of replenishing supplies and stocks that have been used up. I mean, that is such a campaign gift to Democrats or to Republicans who don't want these sort of overseas conflict, just to be able to point to those numbers and say, look, I think that's something that would resonate with a lot of American people.
You do get the sense with the language that President Trump has used on Truth Social, seems ready to move on. He's not looking or doesn't have much appetite for restarting of fighting. And as you said, Katrina, these negotiations could drag on. They could get quite nasty. These are two partners that have known each other and have been negotiating for many years. And if this takes months and there is still very limited movement through the Strait of Hormuz, what does President Trump do? And yet at the same time, he doesn't seem to understand why this war hasn't been popular. Remember, he said, I think it was on Easter Sunday itself, that he would stay in Iran and get the oil, but the American people want the military to come home. And in a social media post later in the week, then said the military will be standing by and getting ready for its next conquest. What would that be? Does he have his eye set on Cuba next, or is he going to focus again on domestic policy? We've talked in the past about how foreign policy is easier for President Trump because he can act unilaterally, more or less, or has been able to, despite some frustration with allies and the frustration allies have with him. But I wonder where he's going to turn his eye to next.
Yeah, I think a lot of people in Latin America in particular be kind of wondering about that, because the administration had kind of shifted its focus towards Latin America for a little while, and this Iran conflict seemed to kind of derail those plans. There's already reporting that they're mulling troop deployments in Ecuador, for example, or kind of expanded strikes against drug facilities. So I think that's a big question for a lot of people in this hemisphere, which I think is also domestically much more simpler for the president to say that in our backyard we can do X, Y, and Z, as opposed to a faraway conflict in a place like Iran.
Yeah, who knows where we will be at this time next week, with ceasefires and talks and everything else that's going on in the world. I mean, we barely even touched on the NATO crumbling that we saw in Washington this week. So we will talk about that anon, I'm sure. Great to chat to you guys as always. If you enjoyed this episode of The President's Path, then like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. We would love to hear from you, so do leave us a comment below or email us on path@bbc.co.uk.